First Sergeant Kep here with Company D, 2nd United States Sharpshooters. Thanks for joining me in the craft room. Today I'm going to walk you through how I make a Civil War Type 3A dog tent. Before you get started, we're going to need to find some source material, some guidelines, some instructions, because your impression can sometimes dictate what type of shelter half or dog tent that you use. Do you have an early war impression? Do you have a mid-war or a late war? Maybe you could be in those cases where your person didn't receive a shelter half until mid-war. Wyman White didn't get his first shelter half until just after Fredericksburg, and he ended up taking a couple off a dead body. So factor that in, figure out which particular type of tent you will need. And sometimes, depending on how authentic you are, the different nuances and variances from certain depots in contractors can make a difference in how you construct your tent. But the Type 3A that I use is really comfortable mid-war. It's simple to make. A little time consuming because all these old tents have tons of buttons and tons of buttonholes, which are really the most time consuming part of the entire tent. But for instructions, years ago, I found these online instructions on one of the reenactor forums. If I can find the link again, I'll have it down in the description. If not, you could probably do some of your own clever researching. But this comes in the form of a packet from Olaf Union Guard. And I've been using these instructions for years. They're fantastic. And the person who wrote this references this book, The Federal Civil War Shelter Tent. I've talked about this in other videos when we talk about dog tents. If you're going to be into making this, pick one of these up, because this will answer a lot of questions that you may have, especially if you're trying to make a particular model or style of dog tent. Like everything else in living history, there are so many variances and exceptions to the rule. This book, while studying actual living, surviving examples, compiles a lot of it to give you some statistics. So if you're trying to make a decision based on the percentage of hand stitching versus machine stitching for your impression, these authors will walk you through it with really fantastic close-up photos, so you can see how the stitching was completed, how tight the buttonhole stitching was, types of materials, but also just walk you through a lot of the exceptions. So this one will walk you through your cut list, a lot of your materials, as well as your layout. This one will give you historical clarification and give you an opportunity to look up close at extant examples to help you kind of understand the instructions a little bit more. Other things that you will need is, of course, material. And the material that you choose is going to depend a little bit on personal preference, as well as the style and contract of tent that you're going to make. Cotton duck was pretty universally common for almost all of them. There are a number of tents early through late war, though it tends to get a little less common late war, where tents were sometimes made out of cotton drill. I like using cotton drill. There were a number of Type 3A tents that were made out of cotton drill. Cotton drill is lightweight. It's like a lightweight canvas. It's a little easier to pack. I still haven't had any problems with it leaking in rain. It's durable. And it's roughly about the same price, maybe a little bit cheaper. So I use drill for my tents. You may need or want to use cotton duck. So you'll need to get your fabric. I make a lot of these, and so I found that it's just cheaper for me to buy the entire bolt of fabric. I just order the whole bolt of cotton drill off the Joann's website. I use my coupons, I watch my sales, and I can get an entire bolt with shipping for sometimes like $90. And this will, of course, last me a long time, but it's always handy. And I've really enjoyed making tents and cutting the fabric straight off the bolt rather than all the different pieces that you can get if you go to the fabric store. Historically, you would have what they would call blue line canvas. And the nice thing about the blue line canvas is that it comes in the proper 33.5-inch thickness that the tents were made from. And the nice thing about having your fabric that wide is that you have two selvage ends. So it saves you on a lot of hemming. So you can see this fabric store stuff is just selvaged on one side, and then the other side gets raw. So the blue line's also really nice, and it's also recognizable because on the selvage side there is a blue string that goes down it. Sometimes people recreate it. It's pretty rare. Every once in a while, someone's trying to recreate it. If you come across it, that might be one of the nicest way for you to go. It's going to cost you a little bit, and you have to keep your eyes open to find it if it does exist. But if you use fabric store stuff, you're just going to have to cut it down a little bit more and do a little bit more hemming. So we have the fabric, and then you're going to need buttons. Now, again, the buttons that you choose are going to vary on the type and time period of the tent that you're making. The Type 3As that I use use predominantly bone buttons, and but there's also zinc and pewter buttons that were used on different models and dates through the different contracts. So make sure you kind of figure out what you're going to be making. I did make a tent that was kind of requested to have a certain type of, I think we did one of the metal buttons. And you can do that, but on that tent, we spent more money on the buttons than we did the entire rest of the tent and materials. So buttons can be the most expensive part of this build. I do have a bit of a Farby compromise. But again, it's only going to be someone who's going to be a nerd in Civil War tents. So to save a ton of money, and they're almost accurate, I get these bone buttons, and they come in packs of 25. We live next to the world's largest bead store, Shipwreck Beads, and they have these 25 packs of these 2-hole bone buttons for only, $3.55. So I've spent $45 on buttons before, but I can get all that I need out of a complete tent for less than $4. And what makes these not accurate is I don't know of any known examples that only have 2 holes. So you could try to keep find 4-hole ones. If you're really handy, you could drill some more holes, but I just let the people I'm making them for know that this is the cost-saving alternative, and everyone's been happy because I think I'm just mostly just make these tents for people in our company. So there's that. So you'll need buttons. You'll need a sewing machine. Now you can hand sew this, but completely hand sewn shelter tents were incredibly rare, but they did happen. So you'll want a good sewing machine, and you'll want a couple of feet. So you'll use your standard foot for sewing the panels together, and then we're going to be doing a lot of edge stitching. So a good zipper foot is going to get a ton of use. You'll use this foot more than this one during the construction of this tent. And then you'll need some wax linen thread for your buttonholes, as well as sewing on your buttons. There are different examples of people using different types of thread for the buttonholes. Again, this book will walk you through when to use it. But I use this. It's so heavy duty, so bulletproof. Really adds to the longevity of my tents. Various cutting implements, layout tools, rulers, scissors, your basic sewing accoutrements for this project. Then you'll also need some hemp rope, 1/4-inch hemp rope. It's been in a lot of our videos. I carry it with me on my knapsack. You'll need some of that. Although there were tent examples for the Type 3A, I think they did use, Manila was known to have been used. So if you go to a hardware store, Manila would be fine if that's all you can get. But you can get some pretty good prices on hemp rope on Amazon, and I'm pretty sure Townsend's sells it as well. You'll need some hemp rope. A lot of pins you will need, as well as, oh, the most important thing, an iron. You'll need an iron and an ironing board to get your best results. If you're new to sewing, ironing is going to give you crisp, even edges for when you're sewing your seams together. If anyone who's been sewing long enough knows that depending on the job, you can spend more time at the ironing board than at the sewing machine, and it makes a big difference. So you'll need to be set up for plenty of ironing and plenty of pinning for the little bit of sewing that you do. The panels, the blanks will go together pretty quick, and then you can just take everything to the couch and hand sew over 40 buttonholes over the course of a couple days, or maybe you're binge watching something, you can get it all done in a day. One last thing before we get started, I think it's important to say, is some of you may be saying, for Sergeant, soldiers were only issued one shelter half. They didn't do the whole tent, right? So that's true for you campaigners and authentics that watch. Soldiers were only issued half of a tent, and that was common military practice for a long, long, long time. But I encourage you, even if you're just being authentic and just making the half, go ahead and make a complete tent. Make both halves. And if you're not going to use it, give the other half to a comrade, someone else you reenact with, because then you know that you're going to have a tent that will match up. During the war, soldiers wrote about the struggles of trying to find two shelter halves that would line up decently to count as a shelter. Because you really can't go back. Because if you make a shelter half, and it's then I'll just make the other half later. If you use the one shelter half a few times before you make the second one, and it gets rained on and it's really dewy, your first one that you made is going to shrink and warp in a way that the second one's never going to mate to, or you're going to have to spend so much stressful time trying to match, adapt the pattern to fit the used one. So save yourself the hassle. Go ahead and plan to make a complete dog tent, and if you're going to be 100% authentic and just carry half, sell it to a partner, or just make someone's day and say, hey, here's a shelter half, and that way at the end of the long march, there's going to be a tent in camp that will button perfectly with yours. So let's go ahead and get started. Now we're at the sewing machine. We're ready to start sewing, but first you needed to get your material, and you need to cut 2 panels 64.5 inches long and then 33.5 inches wide. Now, like I was saying earlier, if you had the blue line, you're just ready to go. But with all the fabric store stuff, you're going to have to cut it down so it's the proper width. The length isn't such a big deal. Generally, the trickiest thing about making a shelter half is having enough room to lay out your fabric, because it can get pretty big pretty quick. So once you have your 64.5 by 33.5 panels, you are going to need to put it this way. Take your right sides and pin them together. Don't get lazy on pinning. Pinning, especially when you're working with this long material, it's going to make sure that your seams stay in line and everything's going to line up at the end. So take your time, be accurate with your pinning. You'll be thankful for it when you're done. Now, for that cutoff, because we had to cut down from the overall width down to 33.5 inches, save your cutoffs, because your cutoff pieces you can use to make your corner reinforcements later. So don't throw these away. You don't need all of it, but you'll definitely need to use some of it, and that'll save you from having to cut up otherwise perfectly good big piece of canvas or drill. So we got this all pinned and ready to sew the center seam. We're pinned along its length, and now we are going to sew it. So we're going to put on our standard foot, and we are going to stitch it with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now, if you're using a much more modern sewing machine, go ahead and increase your stitch length a little bit. A lot of times the factory settings on your newer sewing machines are going to be unnecessarily tight for this. They did have sewing machines during the Civil War. Just generally, the stitching wasn't typically as tight. So if you just increase the stitch length just a little bit, it'll make a big difference. And of course, you're going to need lots of thread to match your piece. I'm using Gutermann 100% cotton thread. So now we are in. Make sure we have our strings under control. And since this is I'm gonna be here for a while, I went ahead and put a piece of masking tape to mark my 1/2 inch seam allowance. This is just going to be an easier visual as I'm here for a long period of time and keep things under control. So I'm going to just kind of get started by hand a little bit, and then back stitch. Okay, holding my threads out of the way so they don't bird nest. And away we go. Now that we have our 1/2 inch seam all the way down the middle of the tent, we're going to press our seam open. We just sewed. So we have our seam right here, and we're going to lay it flat and iron it flat like that. Because we're using general fabric store fabric, we need to finish this, and to do that we're going to fell it. So what I like to do first is fire up the iron and then press this open before we trim one side and iron it some more. I'll show you. Now to flat fell our seam, we need to trim 1/2 down to, say, 1/8 of an inch from our stitch line, all the way down the length of the seam, because when we're done with that, we're going to fold the other side over and over again, giving us a nice finished seam. So just take your time, move everything around, make sure you don't cut your tent where you don't want to. Now I have the one side trimmed to 1/8 of an inch short. I'm going to iron the long side in 2 passes. So the first thing that I'm going to do is take it and I'm going to iron it. I'm going to fold it in half so it matches that stitch line, and then I'm going to iron that into place. And ironing certainly makes all the additional steps easier as you go. So now I'm going to do this along the entire length, and then we'll fold it again and press it again. Now that we have the long side pressed onto itself, we are now going to fold it over our short raw edge, and we're essentially going to sandwich all these raw edges into one another and then press everything nice and flat. Now we have our flat-felled seam pressed and pinned into place. We're at the sewing machine and we have our zipper foot in, because now we need to edge stitch our seam down. Now, there's no way to sugarcoat this. This is the most awkward stitch to do in the entire build, because we're sewing down the middle and we're going to have a ton of fabric crammed up against the wall of our arm. So just kind of take your time and roll it and feed it through as you go. This is also going to be a very visible stitch on the outside. So make sure you take your time, stitch as close to the edge as you can, and just adjust, stitch, feed your fabric through, stitch, and you should have a good result. Let's get stitching. Now that we have the center vertical seam flat felled on our shelter half, it is now time to hem the raw edges. The top and the bottom of the tent still have these raw edges, so we got to take care of those. And each one of these is going to be a 3/4 inch hem. And so we have to do this in a couple of parts. So what I like to do is I will mark a line 3/4 of an inch all the way down the edge, and then I will fold and press the hem to that line, because half of 3/4 is 3/8, and then if we fold it on itself and press it again, that's a 3/4 inch hem. Now, we can't stitch it once we have it pressed. We have to make our reinforcement pieces. So what we're going to do first is we are going to press our edge down, and then we'll fit our corner pieces to that edge. Now that our first fold is done, it is time to fold it on itself, just like that, and press it again. Now, if you haven't done this a lot, you can go ahead and lay out another line to fold to if you need to, but I've done this so many times, I can just use my finger and my thumb as a guide. And just, if you do a good job pressing that first one, the material just kind of wants to naturally fold on itself. Now that we have our second fold nicely pressed, before we get to the corner reinforcements, let's go ahead and pin our hem down, so that way nothing moves out of place while we're doing this next step. Now that we have our hem pinned in place, it's time to address our corner reinforcements. Now, I do this a little bit differently than what's explained in the instructions, because in the instructions they have you just kind of pin this into place before you hem it. I prefer to prep the corner piece after I hem it, because once this is ready, I can just slide it right into that pocket made by the hem, and it goes right where it belongs. I also like to do these one at a time. So I have my right side marked, and on the ends, the front and the back of the tent, we have this selvage finished end. And when we cut our reinforcement pieces, we want to cut it so we have one selvage side. Okay, so we're going to have the right side facing up, facing towards the inside of the tent. And then we want to make sure that we have the selvage on this side, and then we'll have this unfinished side here we don't have to worry about, because this is going to go into the hem. We're going to push that down in there and stitch over it. So that means we need to put a 1/4 inch hem on this side. So I'll flip it over to the wrong side, and I'll mark that so it matches. And then on this corner that I'm working on, we need to do a 1/4 inch hem on the top. So I will mark that, and then I'm going to go lay that out, and I'll press it. Okay, so once again, we're working with right side and wrong side. Our hem on our shelter half, the hem goes onto the wrong side of the fabric, and so the same goes for our corner reinforcements. So we marked our edges so they match our specific corner. So I've made a line at 1/2 inch, because when I press to that 1/2 inch line, we are going to have a 1/4 inch hem that will be sewn down the nice edge stitch. Now we're at the sewing machine. Our bottom hem and our corner reinforcements are pinned into place, and we are ready to edge stitch. And so for those of you new to sewing, that means we're going to use a zipper foot and stitch as close to this edge as we possibly can. Now, you also need to make sure, if you're new, that you plan your sewing angle of attack so that your short side, the side with the least amount of fabric on it, is towards your pocket. So that sometimes means that you'll have to change the different sides of your zipper foot. So since I'm stitching this way, I had to switch to the left side of my zipper foot. So now we are all pinned up. I have my threads pulled up and out of the way. I drop my zipper foot right on the edge, and take your time. This is a long stitch, and make sure you have your little box of pins handy so you can pull them as you go. And away we sew. Now we have our complete machine stitched shelter half. And now it is time for layout. And layout is one of the most, it is the most critical part of the whole build, because if you mess up the layout really badly, then your tent isn't going to button together right, and it's going to look really poorly. This wouldn't have been an issue during the war because these would have stretched and warped, but if you're taking all this time to make your own tent, you want to make sure that the first couple of times you take it to the field, it looks like it's well made. So, as with everything, it's important to keep track of what side of material that you're working on. So I lay out, as you should too, on the right side of your tent, because all these buttons and buttonholes we're going to work from the, I guess, the outside, the right side of the fabric. And you're going to have a row of buttons on 3 sides, on the front and the back, as well as the top. Now, follow your instructions. Again, I'll try to have the links for these different tent styles down in the description so you can follow along. I will say the front and rear edges of the tent, you can go ahead and just do it straight from the instructions. If you are making a complete tent, what I recommend and what I do is, for the ridge buttons, the part that has to button together, I will complete 1/2 completely, and then I will, on the second half, I'll do all the grommets and I'll do the front and back of the tent. Now, for the top, what I'll do is I'll lay my complete tent ridge up next to my incomplete half, okay? And then what I'll do is I'll transfer those alignment marks onto my soon-to-be finished half. So that way, if for whatever reason I'm off a little bit, that despite these guidelines, if I'm off 1/4 or 1/2 inch, that no matter what, the tent is going to button together evenly. So if you have any errors in layout, or your sewing's a little off, that's the place where you can fix a lot of your errors, is by matching them specifically to each other rather than doing it exactly off the guidelines. Because if this is your first time, you may not be dead on accurate. And so just factor that in. It's very helpful. So so I'll save the ridge buttons for last. So what I'll do is I'll start in the bottom corners and I'll work up. Most people will never button the front or rear of their tent to another tent. You can, and it's really cool. We did a video on Civil War dog tent setups where we actually made a shebang dominium by buttoning multiple dog tents end for end to make one really big tent. It's really cool. Not many reenactors do it. It makes for a really, really nice living quarters. But if you're just going to use this solely as a dog tent, you can go ahead and do the front and rear. Because odds are you're never going to button it to anything else. And in the odd chance that you do, it's going to be to someone else's tent. So it wouldn't normally, you wouldn't expect it to button up perfectly every time. So for this one, we start in the bottom corner, and our instructions, which we have right here for this type 3A Remember, follow along with the layout guidelines for your specific tent that you're making. So for this one, we have the first button 3 inches from the bottom, and our buttonholes are a 1/2 inch from the selvage finished end. So it's pretty straightforward. There are lots of ways to lay out your buttonholes. And then once you have, sorry, jumping around. Once you have that first anchor button on the corner, then it's 8 inches on center going straight up. So how I lay this out is I'll just use one of these cheap plastic T-squares, and then I'll have a ruler. So from my first button to my second button is going to be 8 inches, and then I essentially make a corner guide going all the way up the tent. So this, and then this piece of tape here, so when my button is lined up, that if I start my pencil mark here and go forward to the 1/2 inch mark, then I have my desired buttonhole width or length, and then my 1/2 inch from the end. After I complete all the layout, I usually go ahead and just sew all the buttons on really fast. And then I'm ready to start working on the grommets. Now, of course, the buttons are going to have buttonholes, which use a buttonhole stitch. But for these grommets, all you have to do is what they call an overcast stitch. It's nothing fancy. So you just take your thread. In my case, I'm using some wax linen thread. And I'm working on the right side, I guess the outside part of the tent, and I come up from the bottom, going through all the layers of reinforcement, and then pull my thread through, and then I'm going to come back up from the bottom and try to get next to my previous stitch. It's kind of hard to see with the color matching thread, but you just go side by side. Sometimes you gotta move your stitches around, and then you go back underneath. So you're always coming up from the bottom on your stitching, and you go all the way around your grommet, and then when you're done, you just tie off a knot on the underside. So I can get that up there. So you can kind of see how all that stitching is going side by side. We're going to go all the way around on all the grommets. Now, you may be asking yourself, hey, how'd you get your holes so perfectly cut? Well, one tip that's also recommended in the instructions is to get yourself a set of the larger sized leather punches. And I think these are some cheap ones from Harbor Freight. They definitely need to be sharpened before you use them. It makes a big difference. But once you mark out your grommet locations, use a leather punch to punch out the holes so that way they're nice and even. And then you just use the corresponding punch size for the size of rope that you're using. In our case, we're using 1/4 inch hemp, and this fits perfectly. Now, one other thing too is a freshly stitched hole tends to get a little bit snug. So when I'm done stitching this, I'm just going to run my pencil through it to kind of relax it, and then the rope will go right in. Now it's time to sew a buttonhole. For a complete shelter tent, I think it's like 46 buttonholes and 8 hand-sewn grommets. So if you're not good at sewing buttonholes at the beginning, you should be by the end. So we have our buttonhole, and I'll just use my little embroidery scissors to puncture the fabric and cut my length. And I just have a single piece of linen thread. Different tents have documented like different weights and types of thread, but I prefer wax linen thread. So first thing is just kind of pick a spot, come up from the bottom, and we cover this in more detail and more contrasting colors in our sewing for reenactors video. So you just pull it through from the bottom, and now we're going to go over. Now, how close you can stitch the edge is kind of determined by the fabric, and also what side of the fabric you're on. So with canvas and drill, try not to stitch too close. If you do, you'll see that you'll just pull the threads right through the fabric, and then you'll just have to go a little bit further back. So now I go back up from the bottom, and I'm not going to pull it all the way through. Okay, what I want to do is I'm going to take this string, and I'm going to wrap it under the eye, under the back side of the needle, like that. And then I'm going to come up over the top, like that. And then I'm going to pull that through. And that is what makes our buttonhole stitch. So then I'll go over my distance. How tight you go is personal preference. I'll wrap the string under my needle, like that. And then over the point, and then pull the needle. And down a little bit, under the needle, around the top. And then you just do this 46 times, or more or less, determined by the type of tent that you're making. Well, once you have sewn on your buttons and made your buttonholes, you are ready to button your halves together, and you have your very own Civil War dog tent. It's fairly simple, just a little time consuming, making all your, doing all your hand stitching, but it's a fairly simple project to get into, and you have the pride of making something else for your kit. One last thing I like to do when I make these tents is I add a contractor stamp. It's a really nice way to take your work to the next level. And in a article on our website I did some time ago at secondusss.com, I talked about demystifying contractor stamps and reproducing old labels. All you really need is an image of an original label, whether it's through your own independent research. There are several contractor labels in this book, and this is the source that I used to make my contractor stamp. So to do that, all I did was I just kind of picked a label that I kind of liked and scanned it and found a stamp maker on Etsy. And in a short amount of time, they were able to give me a draft for my review. And it was a bit of an investment, but it's something that's unique and that I get to have. So it's not out of the reach for people to find historic images and find an independent maker to help you reproduce those to add a little bit more authenticity to your kit. So again, if you want to learn more, check out this book. It is fantastic. I refer to it all the time. And I tried to leave out some of the intense amount of detail and layout just to try to keep this video as short as possible. But the people who wrote the instructions did a fantastic job, and they're very clear and easy to follow. I just thought I'd show you a little bit of the behind the scenes of making one, kind of go over some common questions, and really, most of all, like we do on so many of our videos on this channel, show you just how accessible making your own reenacting gear is and how accessible the hobby is in general. Let us know if you have any questions or comments down below. Thanks as always for liking and subscribing. Share up this video if you like, and be sure to check us out on Facebook. Our link is down below, and also our website at secondusss.com. Thanks for joining me on this project, and we'll see you next time.